So my name is Nick. I work with the Chilterns Conservation Board. My role is merely to kind of get us started with a little bit of housekeeping before I hand over to Ian to set the session up for this evening. So a couple of bits of housekeeping, if that's okay. I'm sure you're familiar with the drill now by through either these sessions or Zoom, but we'll ask if you can to please keep your videos and your sound on mute. So your video's off and your sound on mute, please. It really helps in terms of avoiding any kind of disturbance as we go through. So appreciate that. If you could observe that, we'll go through. That'd be fantastic, please. We are going to record tonight, as we have done with the other 5 sessions as well. So if you want to catch up again with the session after tonight, or have friends or others who want to watch it, we'll be recording and we'll put them up on our YouTube channel as soon as we get a chance to edit them and put them up the next day or two. So available to watch again. Encouraging, hopefully tonight, lots of questions for Kirsty. I'm sure there'll be lots as we go through Kirsty's presentation. So if you could put all those into the chat, please, in the chat function. Type in your question or any comments in there, and Joe, Neil and myself will do our best to get those all across to Ian to ask of Kirsty when the session finishes about 5:45 or something on this line. So feel free to ask whatever questions you want. We'll try our best to make sure we can put as many of those to Kirsty as we can at the end of the session. For those of you, again, who are BASIS accredited, tonight's session will earn you a point towards your CPD, as the other sessions have. So if that's of interest to you, then feel free to get in touch with Joe after the event and we can give you the session code so you can claim your point and make sure your CPD points are up to date. And final piece for me tonight, very exciting, our friends at the Bucks Owl and Raptor Group are providing 3 barn owl boxes made and fully prepared, the new stock board design boxes ready for 3 lucky prize winners from tonight. So we'll do the draw in the next day or two and we'll let you know. So fingers crossed, maybe your lucky night and we'll maybe a barn owl box winging its way to your farm for installation after the event. So that's up for grabs. So enough from me, really. I'd like to hand over now to Ian Waller, your chair for the evening, to set the session up. Ian, all yours.
Thank you very much, Nick. Welcome everybody. This is webinar number 6 of 6. So we're on a final one. Save the best till last, perhaps. Thank you all very much for attending. And we'll be talking tonight about wildlife friendly farming. The idea behind these webinars has been to enlighten you on what we might be looking to do going forward with ELM. Although we don't know any details of ELM yet, these are really just designed to give you a taster, broaden your horizons and get you thinking in the right direction. Obviously, when we do know some more about environmental land management, we will be sharing it with you. So we'll probably run some other events, maybe like this, depending how things go. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Kirsty. I've known Kirsty about 15 years. It's very engaging. Used to work for the RSPB, now works for Oakbank, who provide a consultation service as well as seed mixtures, and they also do some forestry advisory work. So without further ado, thank you very much, Kirsty. We would look forward to seeing your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Hi, everybody. So I'm just going to start sharing my presentation now, and I'm sure someone will tell me if that doesn't work. Right.
Yeah, that's all there, Kirsty. Full screen.
Super. Thank you, Ian. Thanks ever so much for inviting me to speak in this series of webinars. It's great, and it's great that you've all managed to join us this evening. Thanks ever so much. So I'm going to be talking about wildlife around the farm. So a subject that I could talk about for ages, but I'll try to contain myself to just 30-40 minutes or so. So a little bit of background. My background is I grew up in the north end of the Chilterns. This somewhat grainy photo was of my local patch, Constable Downs, way back in, I think that was January '97. And I used to, as a teenager, I used to wander around the Downs every weekend with my notebook for recording birds and my £20 pair of binoculars, I learned to love the hills, and they're still a really special place for me. I actually fell into farming more by accident when I started working for the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust quite early on in my career, at their research and demonstration farm at Loddington. And since then I've been working with farmers for nearly 20 years, helping them help the wildlife on their land. I now work for Oakbank Game and Conservation as a farm conservation advisor. As Ian said, Oakbank started off as a seed supplier back in 2004, really focusing on shoots and agri-environment schemes. But since then it's grown substantially. So we're now specialist in supporting farms and estates of all sizes and shapes for their conservation work, right from initial advice through to grant applications, and right through to delivery. Our main office is in Cambridgeshire, but we have staff in all corners of England, and even a newly opened satellite office in Oxfordshire. I should point out, for the sake of clarity, that Jim Pace is not on our payroll, at least not that I know of, despite the fact that he's in that photo there. So, why does the environment matter to farming at all? So we all know that farming produces lots of important stuff for us. It produces food, which I'm very fond of. It can provide fibres, fuel. It also provides lots of other things. Clean water. It conserves the soil. It can mitigate climate change. It provides beautiful landscapes like we see in the Chilterns. It provides habitat for wildlife. But as farmers, we pretty much only get paid for this one up here, which I will there. We only get paid for some of that. The rest at the moment is quite difficult to get paid for directly. But we also know that in order for farming to produce all these things, it depends on in a healthy environment. It needs healthy soil. It needs nutrient cycling that works. It needs a source of good water itself. It needs pollination services, dung burial, without which we'd all be in lots of trouble. It needs control of plant pests, atmospheric regulation. So what we see is food production itself actually relies on a lot of environmental features and natural processes. And if you upset those systems, then farming will perform poorly, or it'll be more expensive. So quite literally, our farming businesses rely on having a good environment. Now, where we are in the Chilterns, wildlife is all around us. In some places, it's obvious, it's abundant. In other places, you do have to look a little bit more carefully, but it's always there. So what's around us at the Chilterns? Well, we have a lot of arable farmland, and at first glance, it might seem like it doesn't support very much wildlife, but it's worth taking a closer look, like this longhorn beetle that had been spending the night among the barley ears, same field. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes looking at some of the wildlife that's characteristic of the Chilterns, and which you would have a good chance of finding once you know what you're looking for and where to look for it. So our farmland is important for lots of small birds, and I'm quite keen on my birds, so it's a good starting point for me. But it can be a matter of looking in the right place. So for example, if you're on the lookout for yellowhammers, then I'd suggest you check out the tops of the hedges and isolated shrubs, especially as the males are starting to sing now, so they're quite nice and obvious. If you wanted to find corn buntings, perhaps a little bit later in the year, then check out overhead wires, because they love to sing from overhead wires. Smaller, the archetypal little brown birds, they show quite a bit of white on the wing, linnets down there. They might be flushed from the ground. They're often feeding in flocks on the ground. This time of year, they're still in flocks. They're quite late to break up into their breeding pairs, and then as soon as they finish breeding, they flock up again. So linnets are a really good one to look out for. And grey partridge there, most likely again on the ground, probably flying away from you. That's my typical view of a grey partridge. But they're there if you know what to look for. Excuse me. It's worth thinking that we're so used to recording wildlife by sight and in the daytime, but that can miss things. Nocturnal wildlife, or even wildlife that behaves a little bit differently at night what it does in the daytime, can be overlooked easily. But increasingly we're seeing technologies like audio recording of bird calls overnight, thermal imaging, which is what this was taken with. They're transforming our understanding of how wildlife use our farms and our countryside. This little dot here was actually a skylark in a field that we wouldn't normally expect skylarks to be in. Hadn't really seen them there before, but I went up one evening and it was just sat by the side of the path there. So it is interesting looking at things in a different way. Parts of the arable farmland in Chilterns are nationally important for so-called arable plants. Now, these rely on some cultivation each year in order to germinate. They need that soil disturbance. Now, some of them, the rarer species in particular, can be pretty hard to spot and identify. They can be quite small. So things like there's a shepherd's needle there. Prickly poppy is maybe a little bit more obvious, but you really have to look at the detail of it to see that it's a prickly poppy rather than a common poppy. Pheasant's eye, I'd love to spot one of those. They can be quite hard to find, but sometimes you'll get an idea of places that might be good for them if you look for some of the more common arable plants, like that one in the middle there, which is common fumitory. And that can be very abundant, but if that's growing well, then it suggests that the conditions might be favourable for more scarce arable plants as well. And you often find that they thrive where the soil is particularly thin, especially near the tops of slopes. So those are good places to have a look later in the late spring or early summer. So an obvious feature on farmland are hedgerows, and they're always worth taking a close look at. You know, they're habitats in their own right. They're pretty sensitive to farm management, and of course they form a network, don't they, across the landscape that's so vital for animals and insects to move through. In the area that I took this particular photo in, the hedges were almost all made up of hazel. And I can only assume that's because at some point hazel was a very useful product in the past. But in other areas you'll get more different species. A few areas of the Chilterns you still find a lot of elm lurking in the hedgerows. You might get species like a field maple there on the left with its very distinctive leaf shape, maybe some hornbeam. And of course at the moment hazel is really easy to spot because it's just festooned with these catkins. Wayfaring tree there on the right is a chalk and limestone loving shrub, so we get those in our hedges, and you tend to spot that by its large kind of soft looking leaves, got really dense silky hairs underneath, and that's quite a nice specialist one to get in your hedges. This time of year it's also a good time to have a look at what's underneath the hedges, what's growing in the base, before it gets too tangled over. And very often you will find things like dog's mercury, which is that one there, cuckoo pint, also known as lords and ladies, or even bluebells, as you can see in the background here. And that tells me that this hedge was possibly at some point in the past part of a much larger woodland, or at the very least it's got good connectivity to woods. So it can tell you a bit about the hedge's past and what might have happened to it. I love these veteran trees. Now these are a good one to get your eye into, really old individual trees. Veterans are, I kind of think they're the time lords of the countryside. You know, they age almost imperceptibly, but actually they're easily damaged by accident. And looking after our old trees is so important, not only because they are part of our heritage, but decaying wood that is happening on them, it's crucial for a lot of very specialist species. And this dead wood, this decaying wood, is very often quite scarce in our woodlands today. So it's worth having a look at your hedgerow trees. Are any of them particularly big, old, have that characteristics of veterans, or they might be relics of old parkland, as I suspect this one probably was. It's worth giving them a lot of space. Their root structures are actually very sensitive either to cultivation or even compaction if they get driven on too frequently. So they're worth preserving. And going on to some more trees, obviously the Chilterns are really well known for its woodlands. Very often it's dominated by beech and oak. So once the leaves come out, obviously beech looks like that. Oak has very different shaped leaves, hopefully something familiar to most of us. And in the understory, in the shrubby understory, you'll often find species like hazel, a lot of holly. So it's quite easy to get your eye into and identify. Because beech as a tree casts such a deep shade, very often you'll find in our woods you don't appear to have many wildflowers growing. And what I'm looking for in a wood, for example, a wood that's in good condition will have trees of lots of different ages. It'll probably have a good amount of standing deadwood and fallen deadwood as well. And ideally there should be young trees growing up from the woodland floor. But we do find in the Chilterns that we've got so many deer and the browsing pressure is so high that actually that can be quite a challenge for our woods, is getting that natural regeneration going. However, there are some wildflowers that manage to kind of cheat and get ahead of that bud burst of beech. So here you've got some bluebells just coming through literally now as I speak, and they're going to grow up and they'll flower before actually the beech leaves come out and block out all their light. So that's their strategy to get away. Now's also quite a good time to look out for a few fungi. Obviously, most fungi you'd be looking out for them in the autumn, but this one here, Scarlet Elfcup, is really easy to identify. It's bright red, it's got that really distinctive cup shape, and it's quite common in a lot of woodlands, so it's worth keeping an eye out for when you're going for a walk. If you are lucky enough to have areas of permanent grassland, particularly on a hillside, it's definitely worth taking a close look at the plants that are in there. Chalk grassland is an incredibly rich habitat, supports lots of different plants, lots of different insects, but it does need management. Now I have to confess, this picture is actually taken from the Cotswolds. Here it was some relic chalk grassland, but it hadn't been managed for several years. And although when I looked in there, you could see quite a few of the chalk grassland plants were still there, the scrub had really grown over a lot of it. And you can see that the grasses had grown up really tall. They were out competing a lot of the wildflowers, which were often very tiny. So that's what happens if you don't manage it correctly. I just had to put that one in there because I love chalk grassland butterflies, especially when they pose very nicely. Now some chalk grassland flowers are relatively easy to spot, not necessarily at this time of year. So for example, this tiny little rosette amongst very short grassland on a steep slope. That's not my camera angle, it was at that steep. That will eventually later this summer grow into a orchid, which obviously is nice and colourful, outstanding plants, but they start off very small at the moment. Now chalk grassland plants, they're often quite small, but if you have a close look, you might be able to spot the distinctively shaped leaves of something like salad bonnet over on the left there. They tend to stand out. Or if you're lucky, the milkwort there with its very tiny mauve flowers. And if you've got species like that, then actually they're really good signs that your grassland might be species rich. Some of you might have a chalk stream. Again, the Chilterns is really important for its chalk streams, or you might have perhaps your land drains into one. Now these are quite rare types of watercourses, and they're especially vulnerable to pollution, over abstraction, But when they're in good condition, they support an abundance of wildlife, whether that's above the water, like bee buntings, which again, nice obvious birds. They're starting to sing at the moment. The males there have that black head and white collar, really distinctive. Or wildlife below the water, like brown trout. You're lucky enough to have those. So, what role is there for farming in looking after all of this wildlife? Well, it offers a lot of benefits. For one thing, farming offers space. I mean, farming makes a big impact either way, not least because it is how the majority of land is used in this country. In some places, those arable plants we talked about, they need soil disturbance. So for those specialists, actually, arable cultivation is part of how you keep them going. It's also worth thinking that, you know, in terms of arable farming, we've bred cereals, which are a type of grass, to have these enormous, highly nutritious seeds in the form of grains, which we harvest as food. However, if you're another species, that's really helpful. They can take advantage of that as well. So for a farmland bird, for example, a nice big cereal grain is a lot of food in one nice, easily managed packet. So that's fantastic for them. And for some of those important grasslands that we looked at, the chalk grasslands, grazing is the right type and level of grazing is absolutely essential for managing them and keeping them going. But there are challenges as well. Farming presents. The inescapable one is farming is all about food for people. There is inevitably competition for food and resources with other species, and that's a really hard one to get away with, but we do try to reconcile it. Farming is a much simpler system. It's a simpler set of species. Inevitably, there are kind of fewer niches, fewer species, fewer different relationships. And what you tend to find that leads to is kind of boom or bust population dynamics. So we're making a lot of food for us, but it can also mean that things like pests and diseases, once the conditions are favourable, there's nothing to hold them back, so they can boom as well. And that's where some of our agronomic problems can come from. If you were in a totally natural system, it would be much more complex, and that complexity kind of irons out all this variability, provides a lot more resilience. And there's no getting away that the direct and indirect impact of both physical and chemical operations is there. You know, whilst soil cultivation is needed for some plants, for others it's quite damaging. And from earthworms to ground nesting birds, you don't want to be in the way of a plough. It's also become increasingly highlighted, isn't it, that plant protection products, they need to be used extremely carefully in order to minimise the risk of affecting non-target species. So farming has a really important role in conserving wildlife and being that good steward that we need to be of the countryside. So how can you find out what wildlife is on your farm? Well, I'm going to start online. There are a few resources that if you haven't come across before, it's worth being aware of. There's a website called Magic Maps, which is a really useful starting point, actually. And not only does that have your internationally and nationally designated sites, so everything from a special protection area or a special area of conservation due to triple SIs, or even the historic designations, the scheduled ancient monuments. Most people would be aware if there was one of those on their land already, but they should all be accessible to you through Magic. It also shows you where there are areas that have been recorded as having what we call priority habitats. And these in the Chilterns would be things like that lowland calcareous grassland, that chalk grassland, but also things like traditional orchards. And if it's been recorded before, it probably will show up on that website. And that might give you things that either you didn't know had been on the land itself or perhaps were around you. There are other sources of information though as well. Every county will have access to an environmental record centre, and these are a really rich seam to mine in terms of information. And if you get the chance to retrieve data that they've got for your site, it can be well worth it. Particularly any records of what they call protected and important species, or even invasive non-natives is worth knowing about. So perhaps you might need to do some management of them. The other good one that I'd always signpost people to if they've got some time is the National Biodiversity Network Atlas. Now again, this is a very rich source of online records. The screenshot over to the right there is actually taken from it. And it's worth having a look to see what's been recorded, not just recently, but sometimes those records go back for decades. More recently, there was a bird atlas carried out covering the whole of the Thames and Chilterns area. You might be lucky enough to have a local wildlife group, a group of very knowledgeable volunteers who might like to come and do some recording on your land if you let them. Normally people are only too keen to come and have a look somewhere that we wouldn't normally get access to. So set a few ground rules, make sure everyone's working safely, but that can be a really useful relationship to cultivate. I would just flag that if you are looking for what data might exist elsewhere about your farm, do note that farmland does tend to be under-recorded. So just because you're not getting any information back, it doesn't mean there's nothing there. Don't be disheartened, but it can be worth asking the question. And of course, there's the DIY route. Get out there and have a look. We've had a few pointers this evening about things that you can look out for, but as an example of something that personally I found quite helpful, it's a little app called iRecord. It's very accessible, I think, on your major platforms. It's free. It is pretty easy to use. And what I like about it is once I've taken a photograph of the thing I want to record, I say what I think it is, it records the date, the time, and it's very easy to enter the location. And that record then gets sent off and it gets verified, checked by experts. And so the quality of information is really good. And where that information then goes, it goes into different record centres, the National Biodiversity Network. It goes into the places where it needs to be seen in order to support good decision making in the future. So I do find it's quite useful for species that aren't sensitive, because obviously the data is shared quite widely, and it's good for things that you can photograph and therefore evidence, if you like. So there are places where it's not quite so appropriate, but as a starting point, it's a really good one to practice using and get your hands on. And in fact, you've got a weekend coming up and hopefully the storm will pass. So why not try it out this weekend when you're out on your COVID permitted work or exercise, and try and find a plant and identify it. That would be excellent. So it can be a bit where there has been a lot of recording, and sometimes you'll get a lot of data back, and it can be a bit overwhelming. And there's a job there to sift through which ones are actually most useful to you. Well, there are some habitats and some species that are particularly worth noting. So as I said, those things called priority habitats, anything that's mapped as lowland calcareous grassland. There is some lowland heath in the Chilterns, mostly around Ashridge. Those traditional orchards, and also old wood pasture and parkland. Those would be really worth being aware of on your land. And in terms of species, if you've got species, particularly corn bunting, farmland bird, then that unlocks a particular countryside stewardship option to you, a supplement called SP9, which pays you a little bit extra to do some a bit more detailed arrangement of land management specifically known to benefit corn bunting. The other two species that particular payment targets are turtle dove and brown hair streak butterfly, but they are quite scarce in the Chilterns, so I think it's quite unlikely that you'd stumble across them. But obviously, if you did have them, that would be definitely worth knowing. And there's always the what can I do about it question. I've got all this data I've found out about this rare plant or this beetle that I've got. So what? What am I going to do as a farmer that's different, that's going to help that particular species? So this is where it gets a bit more practical. So I just thought I would so we've looked a bit at the sorts of wildlife that are around, and I wanted to share with you next a few examples of how we can use land management features that are grant funded through the Countryside Stewardship scheme that's available now before ELM comes out, and how to kind of put that together so that it works. It's benefiting the wildlife that you've identified, but it's also fitting in with the farm. So I'm going to talk through a few photographs and arrows and things, and we'll go through. So this was a site that I was at, I think, just a couple of weeks ago, and you can see it's got a little bit of a valley there, fairly steep slopes that are arable, particularly on the site that you're looking from. It was pretty steep, and it ran straight down into that lane, which ran downhill towards the buildings. And to my eye, there was a risk of some runoff. If you got heavy rain and there was no vegetation there, it was left there over winter, then that was potentially a bit of a risk. So and sometimes you can see this more clearly. So again, this was a site I was at a few weeks ago, and you could see at the bottom of the slope there, even with the grass margin, it had carried some sediment from the top of the field further down, and you could see where the water had run over the margin and into the ditch. But there are some things that we can do to mitigate that, to not necessarily stop it in its tracks, but to stop any runoff and that associated sediment and phosphates ending up where we don't want it. So it could be a simple buffer strip, and the big photograph there, as you can see, it's already got a buffer strip. In this particular case, for both of these cases, I'm actually thinking about an option called SW3, which is catchily titled infill grass strips. But basically this pays you for a simple grass seed mix to put it down, cut it at the end of the summer. It's there as a resource protection measure, and you can put that down on quite large areas, up to about 30% of the field. So in the case of these steep slopes, actually we'd probably be looking we could take out quite a big chunk of those slopes and simply grass them down, and get the payment on that area, and that would reduce that risk of runoff hugely. We could also look at perhaps tackling things at source. By putting a winter cover crop in, for example, you're immediately protecting the soil from that rainfall, and reducing the risk of it getting washed off. You're putting living roots into the soil, which are going to be great for the soil health over the long term. Not only keeping growing things in the soil, as the plants grow and photosynthesize, they're putting out those root exudates and feeding your soil biology, keeping that alive and thriving for as long as possible. And if you're in a NVZ, which I'm aware not many parts of the Chilterns are in a nitrate vulnerable zone, but if you have steep arable land that feeds directly into a watercourse, those parcels, those fields would be eligible for that winter cover crop payment through stewardship. But to be honest, cover crops are quite a good thing to be doing anyway. The other option that might be worth thinking about in a situation like this is AB15, which is a 2-year sown legume fallow option, which is a mix of clovers and vetches, with or without grass. It's down there for 2 seasons. You're cutting it quite a lot in first year, and then you're shutting it up in the second year to let it flower. but it's totally non-productive. So you can't use it for forage, you can't graze it. The high payment rate is there because it's out of production for those 2 years. But what it is doing is, again, providing living crops in your soil for a long period of time. And because you're cutting it in its first year, if you do have issues such as blackgrass that are quite tricky to manage otherwise, then actually you do get quite good blackgrass control by the end of the second year on that. And that's quite an interesting option from the point of view of quite a few farmers to make their rotations more diverse, I guess, and possibly replace some break crops that haven't performed very well or becoming quite challenging. I wanted to mention this one as well. So this is an option called GS4, legume and herb-rich sward, which is also known as a herbal ley. Sorry. There we go. Now, in my mind, this kind of sits somewhere between a traditional temporary ley that might be ryegrass or ryegrass and clover over here, and your semi-natural grasslands, really species rich over here. And I think these herbal leys, these GS4, it sits somewhere in the middle. It's a halfway house. Now, unlike that AB15 that we saw before, this stewardship option is designed to be productive. You can cut it and use it for haylage or for hay. You can graze it. It just needs to be shut up for a few weeks early in the summer to let it flower. But other than that, it's a really productive option. Because it's got legumes in there, it fixes its own nitrogen. It doesn't need fertilizer. You're getting all the benefits of things like bird's foot trefoil, which are really good anti-wormers. Stock grow really well on it. So it's a really productive option. And you're getting that £309 a hectare in towards it. And so what I'm finding is some farmers are opting to use this sometimes as a form of arable reversion, put things down to grass, as long as it's not on a steep slope. Or it's a more wildlife and environmentally friendly form of temporary ley that can be rotated around. And for arable farmers looking to put some grass back into their rotation, this can be a helpful stepping stone to do that. Showed this photograph. You can see in the sort of right corner there's a little bit of grassland. That actually used to be ecological focus area when we had that. But of course we don't have EFA anymore. So it would make sense to put that that corner down to something productive that we could pay a payment on. And that could be something flowery. So AB1, nectar flower mix, is a grass-free mix, quite a simple mix of legumes and native wildflowers that you cut half of it in the summer and all of it at the end of the summer. Or maybe AB8, which is flower-rich margins and plots, has grass in it. It's a more natural, long-lasting seed mix that pays a bit more. And what we find is they work in different ways. So the AB1, for example, is rotational. You can move it around, whereas the AB8 is really good for taking out awkward areas from production completely. And all you need to do there is pretty much treat it as a hay meadow and cut it at the end of the season, or even graze it off if you've got the stock to do so. So in this case, that was an awkward corner. It was out of production for a reason. It makes sense to keep it out of production. But actually, we've got these telegraph wires overhead. We could even bring it out to the telegraph wires and save some potential hassle if we're using very large kit there as well. One of the other rotational options is the AB9, the winter bird food mix. This is a great option because it provides a lot of winter food for farmland birds in a small area. It does take some management to get it to grow really well. So you've got to treat it as a crop, which is fine. And it pays £640 a hectare per year. So it's a high payment, but you have to be prepared to put the work in. The background photo I've shown, you can see this massive pile of chalk that's come out. This was badger damage, obviously, but they were digging into a scheduled monument underneath there, which wasn't great. And you can see in the background that brown area of cultivated, that had been game cover, so it had been maize, and of course badgers love maize. So the thought was, if we actually perhaps swap that round a little bit and put in one of these seed mixes that yields smaller seeds, it's not quite so attractive to the badgers, maybe we can persuade them to go somewhere else and make the whole area slightly less attractive for them. But the AB9 mix works really well. Again, don't use it to take awkward areas out of production because you've got to work it. But it works very well in tandem with the AB1, the nectar flower mix, because what you can do is after a few years you can swap them around, clean them up, and you've got your natural fertility from the legumes and the nectar flower mix, and the ability to control weeds that might have developed in your winter bird seed mix. Few boundary options. So here, again, quite a fairly recent photograph. You can see the deer browse line really clearly on that hedge, can't you? It's just, you can see the bottom of the trunks where they've just come along and nibbled. So that would be a really classic hedge that would be ideal to coppice some of the shrubs that would take it, maybe gap it up, and that would make that whole base much thicker, much denser, much more useful for wildlife, because most of your insects are down there. That's where they overwinter. That's where your yellowhammers are nesting. It's all about the base of the hedge. So that would be, there's reasonable payments for hedgerow restoration there. Or this one, which was on a farm of mine just a couple of weeks ago. I had to pull over and admire the hedge laying that they've done. So hedge laying and top binding comes to a total of £12.80 a metre, which is not bad. And where you've got sites that are perhaps in quite visible, or you want that extra bit of effort, then again, stewardship can offer a means of helping to make that happen. And I have to say that did look pretty smart. This was a case where we had the grassland next door was being grazed, but there were some issues starting to develop. The stock were getting down to the banks and causing some erosion, which wasn't great. So again, there's stewardship to help put up some sheep netting there. We can put in a wooden field gate to make sure there's still good access, and just provide alternative drinking places for the stock. We can get paid on the grassland because it was very low input anyway. It didn't have any artificial fertilizer, so it was ideal for the very low input grassland option. And on the other side, actually, it wasn't very accessed, so we can actually just call that the GS1 option, which is, again, it's a snappy title called Take Small Grassland Areas Out of Management, which works up to ½ hectare. But it's a reasonable payment rate on it. So it works for those awkward corners where actually you're quite happy just to shut the gate and walk away for 5 years and let it do its thing. There is a payment for doing that. So there's a good combination of options there that could help improve that particular situation. This is a nice, one of those nice hillside banks of grass that get quite excited at looking at the different chalk grassland plants that might be lurking in there. And if you do have species-rich grassland, either that's mapped already or that you can demonstrate is species-rich, then there's a higher paying option called GS6. It's £182 a hectare, which is really helpful and quite flexible on the grazing as well. If you've got issues of scrub, then you can either love the scrub, and there's lots of reasons why scrub can be a good thing in the right place, or if it's needs a bit of management, then there are some options that help with scrub control, but they're only accessible through a higher tier of stewardship rather than the mid-tier, so that's something to be aware of. And if it's small areas, actually it might be better either to let it get on with it or do it yourself, but it is all doable through stewardship, and these are such important areas. It's worth including them as you can, because it safeguards that favourable management. Coming back to the chalk streams that we looked at earlier, one of the challenges that there can be is obviously where livestock have access to them for watering points. It's not ideal. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It totally depends on the site. But in this case, you can see here the cattle were getting down and they were making quite a bit of mud. It was very easy to disturb, and that sediment was just going downstream quite merrily. So in theory, it would be quite straightforward to fence the stock off from that and provide alternative drinking points. So stewardship will pay for replacement troughs with concrete bases, the pipe work to feed them, which is usually the best option to go for. There are payments for pasture pumps, if that's appropriate as well. So these are cattle activated pumps that draw straight from the watercourse. Sometimes that's the better route to go down. But in terms of minimising those risks of poaching the riverbanks and sediment getting down, there are quite some straightforward solutions for that. And in terms of those orchards, then again, if it's mapped as a traditional orchard, that's great, or you might need to demonstrate that actually it is a traditional orchard, but there is a bit of a higher payment rate for continuing to manage it. If it needs some work to tidy up, then there's some pruning capital items or paying for replacement fruit trees, as well as all the fencing that might be needed. And tree guards as well. You can see this particular case, the naughty sheep had been in there and rubbed most of the bark off most of the trees. So things like that we can remember to build into the stewardship application, and they do help do a good job. I will mention woodland. So at the moment, there's a woodland management plan, which is a great idea to have, and there is a grant to get someone to put a woodland management plan together for you. So if you've got quite a bit, it's definitely worth thinking about. And what the woodland management plan does is, if there is any work that's needed, for example, thinning, restocking, then once that's approved by the Forestry Commission, it gives you your felling licenses. But it doesn't commit you to doing those works in any particular time frame. So it gives you quite a bit of flexibility in how you go forward. In terms of payments for actually doing works, those only sit under higher tier. And what we do find is it's definitely worth going for if you have a lot of woodland. If you're a large estate, you've got 100 hectares or so, then it makes sense to perhaps go for that. If you've got small areas of woodland, it's probably not the right course of action for you at the moment. I'm very much hoping that under ELM we will have some better management options and payments for looking after woodlands, because they do so much for us. So just to pull that together as an example, here's a nice view out over a typical view. So for example, if that's one field parcel along there, then I would be thinking either of claiming that as very low input grassland, or if it meets the criteria, it could be species rich grassland along the top. Towards the top of what had been cultivated strip there, so I might leave a strip there for cultivated arable plants and see what comes up, because that's looking like quite a good potential spot for them. But actually the rest of it is quite steep sloping, it doesn't yield terribly well, so why not put it down to AB8 flower rich plots and get a good payment on it, and it would complement then the existing areas of flowery grassland as well. And we've got the hedge out the front that could just do with being restored and rejuvenated once more. So you can see a landscape, it does kind of come together, and you can start put together a plan of appropriate options. So top tips, get some good advice, both at the start, throughout the process. It will really help. If you're going down this route and you've got an agronomist, get them involved. They'll know, there'll be a rich source of information that you can help, and they're your trusted advisor throughout. So do involve your agronomist when you're putting these things together. be honest. Be honest about the yielding potential and the profit potential of fields or particular bits of field. It's not all about pub yields, but if you're picking out those areas which are a bit of a challenge, then actually maybe it is worthwhile putting them into an option. Equally, there might be areas which it's not appropriate to, because they are worth carrying on farming. And thinking back to the very beginning, identify what you've got already. Make sure you know where your existing habitat is. Then use those right options to both manage them appropriately, keep them, improve them, and extend them. And that's right. And don't forget to, once it's all in place and it's all working, enjoy it. It's allowed. It's good fun. Lastly, why bigger is better. So it can be easy to think at the farm. So we've talked at the moment about farm scale, what's on your farm, what you can do on your particular farm. But of course, no farm is in isolation. And from a wildlife point of view, they don't see farm boundaries either. So this swallow here, for example, he is looking fairly grumpy because he's just arrived from West Africa and it's still cold. They have an international perspective, don't they, on migratory birds? But equally, insects, small mammals that move around a lot, they don't respect our farm boundaries. So we do have to have that bit of a broader overview as to how it all fits together. Where you've got bigger areas of natural habitat, then it provides wildlife with resilience, because if something happens that goes wrong over here, you've got a much bigger area that's still good. And those sorts of chance events might be something a bit going wrong. It might be as simple as disturbance and birds needing somewhere safe else that they know they can go to. That connectivity element that we're all so familiar with, it's essential for helping those wildlife that can move around to spread, to move away from problems and to take advantage of new opportunities to recolonize new areas. Connectivity, whether that's direct, contiguous areas or stepping stones, they're really important. Some species live their whole lives in those kind of wildlife corridors. I mean, think about bats foraging up and down a hedgerow. They don't really stray outside of that hedgerow corridor at all. So for some species, it's particularly important. There can be efficiencies of scale in terms of conservation as well. I think we often overlook that. But for example, in terms of managing grasslands properly, getting the right stock available to do it, or being able to cut and collect cuttings, or even doing things like tree pollarding and use of tree shears. Sometimes actually, if you've got a worthwhile area to do, it's much easier to do it well and more efficiently. And I think the other thing I'd say is, if you've got a network of people, farms all doing similar things, then actually you're developing that local pool of experience. And there's something to be said for kind of normalizing conservation, that you're not the only one doing it, but actually your neighbour is going through exactly the same learning curve, or might even be further up it than you. And I think that's a really useful element to having this joined up approach to conservation between different farms. So change is coming, isn't it? In fact, change isn't just coming, it's already started. And I think now is a good time to have a review your environmental plan, and make sure that your wildlife is conserved and enhanced wherever possible. Now, obviously, stewardship is just one route to support this, but it does offer some funding to help with some of the things that we've looked at today, as well as supporting some of the changes that may well be needed to ensure that our farm businesses can continue to thrive into the future. So thank you very much indeed for allowing me to share some thoughts with you this evening. And I look forward to your questions via Ian.
Thank you, Kirsty. Riveting. Pulled it all together. Really sort of told some stories there to sort of inspire us. I will say I will collect a fee for the photographs you've taken on my farm. And that tree is still there. I know you quite like that sweet chestnut that's in that field. I remember you commenting on it 12 years ago. So, right, a few questions that I've managed to string together. I think my WhatsApp's playing up, so we're struggling a bit. But anyway, here we go. What would you say the biggest thing, the biggest single thing we could do as farmers to really make a difference on our farms? Is there one key thing you could tie it down to?
Gosh, that's a good question, isn't it? One single thing. I think for me, from working with lots of different farmers over the years, I think it starts with that attitude. It starts with being inspired and wanting to do something. I think the rest follows on. How you do it and what you do it, you can tackle. But if you can find something that sparks, that gets your interest, that you want to do. So I say find your hook, whether that's soil health, whether that's farmland birds, whether it's butterflies. Find something that you decide you want to make a difference for and go from there. Once you've got your focus and your objective, the rest will follow on. So actually, I think it starts off with, what do you want? What do you want your farm to do for you and for whoever follows you?
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, isn't it? Because there's one, you need to follow a passion, and from that passion, more enthusiasm and will develop on a wider scale, because we can't, as farmers, know everything about everything. So we need to find key things that we can then broaden our horizons from and expand our knowledge and build on, really. And that's what we do as farmers anyway, but we've really got to do that in an environmental way as well. So that's a really good point. Why is it so important? You mentioned reporting records. Why is that so important to record these things and report it to the various collection areas? I think I know why it is, but would you like to elaborate on that to enlighten them?
Yeah, and I think it can be a sensitive subject, because obviously it's data from your farm. It's effectively your data, but for some things in particular, it is worth making the right people aware of it. Mentioned, for example, corn buntings. So the presence of that particular species, if it's known about in the right places, that will unlock to you a payment that you wouldn't have access to otherwise. And similarly for things like that species-rich grassland, a lot of it is recorded on that. They call it a priority habitat inventory. But if it isn't, then actually you're going to struggle to access those higher payments for managing that species-rich grassland, just because nobody knows it's there already. And what we're finding is, in all sorts of other areas of life, these priority habitat inventories are being used to make big decisions. It'll influence what ELM comes out with in that middle component, that local nature recovery strategy. It will influence large planning projects or infrastructure projects, because they're all looking to the data that's held by the record centres on these inventories. And I do fear that if that data isn't right, if it's not correct, if it's poor data, then you're going to get poor decision making out of it. Now, obviously, there are some species that, as land managers, as farmers, you might not want people to be very aware of, and that's completely understandable. But I think it's worth having in the back of your mind that if nobody knows what's going on in your farm at all, then how can people be expected to value it in the future? So it is something to exercise a bit of discretion on, but there is a place for passing on some records to the right people, so that actually you're laying the foundations. They're your natural assets. And I think if we're moving to a situation where actually your natural assets are what you're being paid for by the public in the future, then actually you want that payment to be right, don't you?
Yeah, so yeah, record is really the take-home message, isn't it? And share. So it's and build that knowledge and reach out to local nature groups, and there's a lot of help out there. A lot of people want to come onto our farms to survey things, and we all need to do more to build that trust between nature groups and farmers and nature groups. So this is quite a topical question. Is wormers are sort of in the spotlight again at the moment, really. You know, we've all been pressurized with obviously arable and grassland applications of pesticides, but the thing that we always overlook is sheep and cattle wormers, and how can we make them have less impact in the environment? You know, it's, people don't really consider them to be pesticides, but they are at the end of the day, and they are having a big impact on our biodiversity. Have you got any sort of experience or messages there on how we should be selecting our wormers? As ever, everything gets stronger and stronger, but is that necessarily the right way to go?
Yeah, it's a good one, and I'm not going to profess to be an expert on this particular area, but you're totally right. It is an area that has been a little bit overlooked, and I think in the last 10 years or so there has been increasingly evidence that actually a lot of the wormers, things like ivermectins that we have been using, probably are having an effect on particularly those invertebrates and the life involved in nutrient cycling. So you think of, you know, the classic is you go around looking at your cowpats, and if the cowpats from 2 weeks ago are still there, well, there's probably a reason that, you know, they haven't been worked down by the bugs and beetles and flies. That's probably not a good sign. So there are ways that I think we can be more thoughtful with the use of our wormers. So thinking about when we treat animals, when they're going to go out into the field, when it's going to be spreading. And obviously there are some of the options that I talked about today, things like that herbal ley, have plants in them that are natural wormers, which is fantastic. But in terms of choice of product, I'm probably not the best person to talk to there. But it's a really good point, and I'm glad that someone has raised it, because it needs a bit of thought, like most of these things.
Yeah, I'd try, and I've got a chicory ley, as you've seen, and that's my sort of try to, you know, reduce my reliance on wormers, and you know, lots of little things will help. As ever, we've run out of time. An hour flies by. We've overrun quite a bit. I really enjoyed tonight, Kirsty. Thank you ever so much. It's been a really enlightening presentation. You've given us some valuable information there and some ideas in better ways we can look at our land, and we just need to step back sometimes and see the bigger picture, as it were. So thank you ever so much. I ought to say as well to everybody, this wouldn't have happened without the great work behind the scenes. The three key players have been working really hard, and you've obviously heard Nick speaking in the lead up to it, but Neil and Joe in the background as well have held this all together and supported me through this. I'd personally like to thank them. It's been really engaging. First time I've done anything like this, so thanks very much to you three. Made it work, and we've delivered on what we set out to do. And thank you everybody for taking part. It's been a really quick 6 weeks that we've whistled through, and I hope you've all got something from it, and you can all sort of look at your farms in a different way. And good luck with what the future may hold for us. Thank you everybody very much. Goodbye.